Good evening. I hope everybody can hear me. I do want to mention that we do have assisted listening devices up toward the front, so if anybody cannot hear me and would like to use one, we invite you to do so. And also, please turn off cell phones. It's always good to have a little reminder. Great. Good evening. My name is Sherry Litwack, and it is my honor to welcome you on behalf of the trustees of the Concord Free Public Library Corporation to the first annual Joel Myerson Memorial Lecture. When Joel unexpectedly passed away in 2021, the many research institutions and literary societies with whom he had close connections were shocked and saddened. Joel was not only a respected colleague, but he was also a great friend. The William Monroe Special Collections at the Concord Free Public Library, along with representatives from the Louisa May Alcott Society, Margaret Fuller Society, the Ralph Waldo Emerson Society, the Thoreau Society, and the Association for Documentary Editing came together to look for a way to honor Joel's legacy, and the Joel Myerson Annual Lecture Series was established. The series will engage the public in the study of American literature and literary history, focusing on writers associated with Concord, Massachusetts, and American transcendentalism, with an interdisciplinary outlook. The series will highlight the work and ideas of emergent scholarship, drawing on the values Joel personified as a generous mentor, teacher, and public speaker, and amplifying the diversity of representation that Joel exemplified in his textual scholarship and editorial initiatives. The series will promote lifelong learning and the recovery of primary source materials that teach us about the future as well as the past, beginning in Concord and radiating outward to American literature and culture as a means to engage with current events, conservation, and reform. It is now my great pleasure to present Greta Little, Joel's wife, friend, and colleague, who would like to say a few words. Greta? Come here.
All I want to do is to thank all of you, especially the corporation and all of the societies. It doesn't hurt to repeat them if I can remember them all. The Association of Documentary Editing, the Ralph Waldo Emerson Society, the Margaret Fuller Society, the Henry David Thoreau Society, and the Louisa May Alcott Society. All of these societies, authors, people were so important in Joel's life, and each of you who were his friends and colleagues, he would be so pleased by this, and I just want to say thank you.
Hello, good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Weisenberg from the University of South Carolina, and I am here representing the Ralph Waldo Emerson Society. And I'm going to start off, the different author societies have decided to sort of encapsulate what Joel meant to them from the society standpoint, but also from a scholarly standpoint. So Joel Myerson was a founding member of the Ralph Waldo Emerson Society, a past president, a recipient of the Society's Distinguished Achievement Award, a graduate of Northwestern in 1971, and a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of South Carolina. Joel was a major figure in 19th century American literary studies, whose scholarship on Emerson and other transcendentalists was foundational. He edited many previously unpublished works by Emerson, wrote the definitive descriptive bibliography of Emerson's published works, and several studies in the field of secondary bibliography that surveyed the critical and historical reception of Emerson's influence. He participated in the textual editing of the collected works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Emerson's later lectures, and in editing of many collections of critical essays on Emerson and other figures. What I've briefly outlined only scratches the surface of Joel's work on Emerson, and as others here will attest, Joel's scholarly output far exceeds merely Emerson and included the likes of Thoreau, Fuller, Whitman, Dickinson, Alcott, and many more. To look at the books and essays he published is to look at an entire bookshelf. It's a body of work that makes other academics nervous and fearful. How could any of us possibly measure up to this? Joel's career is a testament to Emerson's claim in Nature that, quote, "A man is fed, not that he may be fed, but that he may work." And Joel worked. But as important as all of his published work is, it's not what made Joel special, nor is it the sum total of what made him so central to the various scholarly societies represented here this evening. What made Joel special was his curiosity, his generosity, and his kindness towards others. Again, to quote Emerson, "A friend is a person with whom I may be sincere. Before him, I may think aloud." And it was by and through thinking aloud with Joel that many of us who study Emerson were mentored by him. If one were to look at the acknowledgments pages and notes and works cited lists in the many studies of Emerson and the Transcendentalist published over the past 30 years or so, then one will likely find Joel's name alongside many words of thanks. In addition to his own scholarly output and the mentoring of others, Joel was a great bibliophile. He not only collected books, but manuscripts, ephemera, and realia as well. Emerson opined that, quote, "Colleges, whilst they provide us with libraries, furnish no professor of books, and I think no chair is so much wanted. If they perchance have met in some great beyond, then perhaps Joel will inform Waldo that he was the professor Emerson imagined." His bibliomania was a trait that he learned from Harrison Hayford, and like Hayford, Joel would advise others in book collecting and often gifted books to colleagues, friends, and students. He had a canny understanding of the book trade, and he tied his collection to his scholarly pursuits by focusing his efforts to support his bibliographic research. He also worked to develop collections of often overlooked authors, such as Margaret Fuller and Louisa May Alcott, and his collecting and publishing on both helped lead to a richer academic study of each. Later in life, his work on Alcott led to his collecting children's literature with the same characteristic interest and zeal that he brought to all of his projects. Due to his and Greta Little's generosity, the University of South Carolina is home to his collection of more than 11,000 volumes of 19th century American literature and their collection of multicultural children's literature from around the world. I've had the privilege of teaching with these collections in a variety of different courses and contexts, and can attest to the fact that his passion for books has not only benefited those of us who rely on his scholarship, but has also enriched the lives of current undergraduates and members of the public who get to work with and enjoy these items. I think it's fitting that the Concord Free Public Library hosts these lectures in Joel's honor, in part because this is a place to which he returned again and again to do his own work, and in part because the mission of libraries as storehouses and interfaces of human culture was so important to both Joel and the literary figures he studied. No one person's memories or author society's in memoriam statement is capacious enough to articulate how important Joel was to so many. However, Emerson was a figure whom he returned to and wrote about throughout his life. And in his own life, he exemplifies Emerson's idea that, quote, "Whenever the sublimities of character shall be incarnate in a man, we may rely that awe and love and insatiable curiosity will follow his steps." Joel was a kind man, a generous scholar, and a deeply engaged mentor who encouraged others to be thoughtful, tenacious, and caring. He was not merely the dean of Emerson studies. He was a consummate gentleman and a man of great character. He is greatly missed, but his example lives on in those of us who have on our own sought a poetry and philosophy of insight. Thank you very much. And I Just want to point out really quick, the Emerson Society published an in memoriam for Joel Myerson. I could only fit 10 in my bag. There'll be, anyone who wants one can have one, and if you don't get one and you really want one, I have business cards. You can email me and I can get you a copy. And next, we will hear from the Thoreau Society.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you to the library, the corporation, and Anka for putting this together. I'm Sandy Petrolinas. I teach at Penn State University. I'm here as the representative of the Henry David Thoreau Society, which has the distinction and the great pleasure of being the oldest society dedicated to the legacy of an American author. Joel served as the Thoreau Society's president from 1992 through 1996. Current Society President Rochelle Johnson has asked me to please send her greetings to all of you. She regrets that she's not able to be here because she's still in the middle of a busy semester at the College of Idaho. Rochelle asked me to convey how honored the Society is to be part of the important memorial series held in honor of a long-valued and deeply missed member of the Society. All of us prize Joel as a friend and a mentor. Thinking about him so often over the past year and a half, I've realized that, to me, others may disagree, Joel was really the consummate Thoreauvian, sometimes cantankerous, always conveying an exuberant joy in the pursuits of the academic life. I was a graduate student with my friend Noel Baker when I met Joel for the first time, and our dissertation director that morning just said, "Oh, by the way, you're coming to lunch today with Joel Myerson and me." And we both flipped out. At least I did. I think you did. I was nervous. I was petrified. I had not read and prepared for meeting the scholar of transcendentalism. 10 minutes into lunch, maybe less, we were friends. Joel didn't say a word about what he was doing or his career or his anything. What were we reading? What were we thinking? What were we working on? And so it ever was in my entire experience with Joel. He lived according to Thoreau's firm notions of ethics, practical pedagogy, and generous friendship. I think he would be proud and maybe even a little abashed at this lecture series in his honor. At a recent summer institute for college teachers here in Concord, Joel was the featured speaker on the first day. 2 weeks later, as the program wrapped up, one young teacher remarked that thanks to Joel, I now appreciate how these writers are still alive, how the text is alive and always in process. I'm sure that this lecture series is a Thoreauvian legacy that will keep the text that Joel so loved alive for years to come. Thank you. And next we'll hear from the Margaret Fuller Society.
Thank you all for being here. I'm Phyllis Cole from the Margaret Fuller Society, and I want to say that Joel was a major player in the recovery of Margaret Fuller as a woman writer in the 1970s and 80s. As scholars of women and of transcendentalism came together to put her on the map. Almost his first year of publishing anything, imagine that, 1973, one of his 4 articles was an edited text by Fuller, alongside pieces on canonical writers Emerson, Thoreau, and Hawthorne. Joel was already at work to broaden the canon, or maybe we could say he didn't care who was in it or not. This was 3 years before the publication of Belle Gail Chevigny's famous, groundbreaking feminist edition of Fuller's writing. Joel also has always held doors open for others, rather than just walking through them himself. I'm amazed to discover that the same year as his first Fuller publication, 1973, he offered a seminar at MLA, Modern Language Association, called Research Opportunities in Margaret Fuller Studies. And meanwhile, he also staged an exhibit on Fuller at the University of South Carolina that was titled From the Collection of Joel Myerson. So He had been at it for a long time, apparently. Wow, he was that early in both collecting Fuller and bringing her to the eyes and minds of other people. Suitably, throughout the 70s and 80s, his major work on Fuller was a series of bibliographies and collections of essays by others about her. He followed everything, encouraged new work, collaborated, made things available. So it was only natural that when the Margaret Fuller Society was organized in 1992, he was there, along with major instigators Bill Gale, Chevigny, and Larry Reynolds. He served first as vice president and soon as president. Quite simply, Joel has been a leader in making our organization and our field of study possible. We're the product of a somewhat rare convergence, I think, of feminist and transcendentalist scholars, writers, and fans around the country and around the world. And Joel has been a leader in making that happen, often with a joke or an invitation to share lunch or liquid refreshment, as well as always to share news of our work, whether completed or still possible. This very week, I want to end with this, I've been using his very first publication, his first piece on Margaret Fuller from 1973 in my own research. His mind and voice and outreach to others are all still alive. Thank you. And our fourth speaker will be Dan Shealy for the Alcott Society.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Again, thanks to the library for hosting this wonderful ongoing event and to the corporation for sponsoring it. I'm Daniel Shealy, by the way, representing the Louisa May Alcott Society. The Louisa May Alcott Society was founded in 2005, and Joel Myerson was its first president. Joel has gone a long way, as most of you probably know, in helping to solidify Alcott's position, I think, in the American literary canon. Joel and I did a lot of work on Alcott together. I was a student of Joel's at the University of South Carolina, a doctoral student, and did my dissertation with Joel Myerson. It's very funny, I can remember the first time at South Carolina when I went into his American Romanticism class. The very first morning, he came in ranting and raving about students who had somehow or another entered the class without his permission. I immediately went out of the classroom and dropped the class and revisited Joel a couple of years down the line. I'm glad that I did, because not only did I end up obviously doing my doctoral work with Joel, but he also taught me a lot on how to be a scholar, but even more on how to be a person. We can talk about Joel's great scholarly accomplishments. You can see all the books. They're on the shelves, and they are amazing. And it is rather intimidating, too, to be Joel's student and to, realize the output that this man has done. But Joel was a wonderful human being. He was generous. He was kind. He was thoughtful. He also loved Concord. Many people might not sort of realize this about Joel. I mean, he was born in Boston and loves to tell people that he was born in Boston. I think Poe used to do that too. But he grew up down in Florida and went to school in New Orleans for his undergraduate and then to Chicago for his graduate degree. But Joel really found his home in Concord, I think, in many ways. on the various projects that we have done through the years. I spent a lot of time with Joel Myerson in Concord, a lot of time in this library, back even before the new special collections room was built. And I remember the first time, maybe it was 1985 when I came here with Joel, and he told me two things. This was when Marcia Moss was the special collections, and I'm sure that many of you perhaps still remember Marcia. He told me two things about my visit. He said, one, you make sure you call her Miss Moss, not Marcia. And he said, on your way out, thank Miss Moss for your being able to work at her library. And that started a very good relationship with the special collection librarians through the years. But the other night, maybe a week ago, late night, I woke up on the couch and there was an old movie on TV. And it was a Spencer Tracy movie. I love Spencer Tracy. Northwest Passage from 1940. It's about Rogers Rangers. And there's a scene where one of the characters, one of the soldiers, comes in from battle worn, and he just says, I'm going home. I'm going home for supper. I'm going home to Concord. And, it just made me think about something that had happened with Joel the last time I was here. I was here with Joel in November of 2021, and we were here 5 days working at the library together. And I remember one of our last nights, we had been out late to a friend's home. Hey, Bob. Walking all the way down Main Street in a cold autumn night, Joel said, God, it's good to be back. And I could really tell that because, the pandemic had kind of kept him sequestered on his back porch there in Columbia, South Carolina. And he really could feel it. And I got a sense that, you're kind of like that Rogers Rangers character, right? You're going home. And it's nice, I think, in many ways that Joel is home. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Noelle Baker. I'm representing the Association for Documentary Editing. The Association for Documentary Editing, or ADE, attracts people who recover primary source materials, largely historians, but also librarians, archivists, musicologists, and scholars from literature, philosophy, and science. Relative to Joel's commitment to share his expertise widely, the ADE also welcomes those who advance knowledge beyond the academy, including students, genealogists, community groups, and families seeking ancestors. The ADE's community vision echoes such public-facing aspects of Joel's career. As a result, it also resonates with the Joel Myerson lecture series statement of purpose that you've already heard. The ADE's vision statement suggests that documentary works enable the generation of knowledge, support personal and community memory through works of recovery, and assist educators in introducing original source materials in the classroom. As the foregoing implies, the ADE will add value to this lecture series, to the public and to lifelong learners, while also honoring Joel's memory. In the coming years, I look forward to working with Anka and the 4 Single Author Society representatives here tonight. Since the ADE's founding in 1978, only 6 literary editors have been elected president. Joel was the first. As a member of that very small group, I can speak to the challenges and the rewards of interdisciplinary leadership. But Joel's version makes it look easy, friendly, fun. I can tell you unequivocally it's not. His success underscores the unique nature of Joel's able governance. In a testimony to that leadership, the ADE recognized him repeatedly, including the bestowal of its highest honor, the Julian P. Boyd Award, shared with Ron Bosco. Joel was also the first literary editor to win the Lyman H. Butterfield Award for his scholarship, teaching, and service. And he was granted the Distinguished Service Award to honor his accomplishment in gaining the Modern Language Association affiliate status for the fledgling and unappreciated ADE. On the day of Joel's death, I reached out to a number of ADE members personally as president of the group, and a common thread emerged, highlighting his commanding knowledge, his deep generosity, and outsized presence in any room. As one former president observed, he was the soul and essence of the ADE. Another emphasized mischievousness. Joel was for having fun. Huh? One of the most productive documentary editors on the planet was able to play? Maybe there's something in that, and I should give it a try. So should we all. I raise a glass to Joel. Tonight, let's celebrate him by having fun. Thank you very much.
My name is Anke Voss, and I'm the curator of the William Monroe Special Collections here at the Concord Free Library. And I also wanted to say thank you to Sherry and the corporation for their support of this series, and to my collaborators in envisioning this ongoing tribute to Joel. And we're so pleased to be the host of this event today and into the future. And I too also want to acknowledge Guido's presence, and I'm so pleased that you can be here, and it's been such a pleasure getting to know you. I am here to welcome our speaker, Professor Megan Marshall, and I'm so pleased to have this introduction as our inaugural speaker of the Joel Myerson Lecture Series. The Concord Free Public Library and the William Monroe Special Collections have enjoyed a close collaboration with Professor Marshall for a number of years, hosting her insightful lectures and benefiting from her invaluable insight in preparing past exhibits, and in the current one, to accompany her talk, which is on view in cases here right outside of the forum. Professor Marshall is the Charles Wesley Emerson College professor at Emerson College in Boston. She teaches narrative nonfiction, live writing, and the art of archival research in the MFA Creative Writing program. She is the author of 3 biographical works: The Peabody Sisters, 3 women who ignited American Romanticism, winner of the Francis Parkman Prize, Mark Leighton History Prize, and Massachusetts Book Award Nonfiction, as well as the finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Biography. Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, winner of the Pulitzer Prize in Biography and Massachusetts Book Award in Nonfiction. And Elizabeth Bishop, A Miracle for Breakfast, a finalist for the Christian Gause Prize in Literary Criticism of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. Among her numerous other awards and recognitions, Professor Marshall received the Walter Harding Distinguished Service Award from the Thoreau Society in 2022. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Professor Megan Marshall.
Take it away as well. Okay. All right. Okay. I hope we're having no interference with other microphones. Can you hear me all right? That's great, thank you. I'm not going to say any more about Joel right now because I think we're going to really feel his spirit at the reception afterwards in the rotunda in front of Emerson's sculpture, the sculpture of Emerson. I've heard Joel give so many wonderful speeches standing right in front of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and we'll think of him there. It's been a great honor to be invited to speak tonight, a guest of all the many author societies. I'll do my best to live up to Joel's example. I want to thank also for their contributions to my research and thinking in this talk, Susan Abele, Kent Bicknell, Kate Culkin, Chish Hopkins of Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, Etta Madden, and Laura Rockefeller. Afterlives is, I hope, will be the title essay in a collection of essays that I'm working on that explore what happens to biographers after they've finished writing their enormous subjects. You know, what are the preoccupations we have? And then also maybe what happens to our subjects in their afterlives. So this is the title essay. It could have been a slide talk, but you can see the images that I'll be referring to out in the exhibition that Anka put out. So I think I'll just start in, except to say, I've given it the title of Bringing Una Hawthorne Home. That's the subtitle, and she is the through line in this, but you'll hear about some other afterlives as well. Afterlives. Dead men tell no tales, but dead women do, at least to me. They speak in questions. The first and most insistent was Una Hawthorne, the eldest child of Nathaniel and Sophia Hawthorne, whose puckish disposition as a girl had been grafted by her father onto Little Pearl, Hester Prynne's willful, out-of-wedlock daughter in The Scarlet Letter. I'd given 2 decades to researching and writing a biography of the Peabody sisters, the youngest of whom was Una's mother, Nathaniel's wife, Sophia, a promising artist at the time of their wedding in 1842, active in her studio through their first year of marriage. That's where my book ended, with Una's birth in 1844, the year Sophia turned 35 and Nathaniel 40. By then, the Hawthornes and Sophia's 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, were well launched. Along with the bold intellectual and social movement, Transcendentalism, they'd done so much to initiate. And as an aspiring writer who struggled to make time for my work while raising 2 daughters, I'd been reluctant to face Sophia Hawthorne's renunciation of her talent in motherhood, her decision, as she once wrote to a wealthy friend who'd offered to pay for a nanny after the birth of Una's baby sister Rose, Sophia's 3rd and last child, so she might return to her easel. Painting, for the present, must go by the board, and what is more shall go, Sophia wrote. Her children would be the best pictures I ever painted. Sophia Hawthorne never completed or even commenced another work of art. Now, on a warm evening in late June 2006, a year after my book was published, I was facing both mother and daughter in death. The Dominican Sisters of Hawthorne, New York, an order of Catholic nuns founded by Rose, the youngest Hawthorne child, who'd taken vows in midlife, had arranged for the transfer of Sophia and Una's remains from Kensal Green Cemetery in London, where they'd been buried in 1871 and 1877, Sophia at 61, Una at 33. The 2 women were to be reunited with Nathaniel, as the Dominican Sisters thought of it, on Author's Ridge in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, a popular tourist site in Concord, Massachusetts, where the town's famous literary families were interred, the Emersons, Thoreaus, Alcotts, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose wife and children had died too far off to keep him company in the afterlife. We were seated on folding chairs in a small windowless assembly room at the interior of Rosary Hill Home, the hospice for impoverished cancer patients Rose had established in 1900 and the Dominican sisters still operated, Sophia and Una's first stop on their way home to Concord. Home to Concord. Sister Mary Joseph, the Dominican Sisters public relations officer, had invited me and a fifth-generation representative of the Hawthorne family, the poet Allison Deming, to witness the Hawthorne women's return to the U.S. A plain wooden casket, child-sized, Sister Mary Joseph said, lay before us on a table. She slipped out of the room, the white skirts of her habit rustling as she shut the door, telling us, "You can look inside if you'd like. But you won't find much, just bits of bone and cloth. It's been a long time." Over 120 years. Long enough for the scant remains of two grown women buried side by side to commingle. Raised Unitarian in a family that prefers cremation and long-delayed celebrations of life for our dead, I'd never attended a wake or a viewing. The ritual I assumed Sister Mary Joseph was permitting us to enact in private. The undeniable curiosity I felt was mixed with dread, despite the assurance there would be no skeletons. I deferred to Allison, the blood relative. She lifted the lid. Tissue paper lined the box, and there were layers separated by more tissue paper that I knew we wouldn't explore, but on top rested a few fragments of bone, slim and white, like worn-down bars of soap, the remnant of a pale blue knit stocking, a tarnished silver Maltese cross, and two full heads of hair, each culminating in a long, thick, rope-like braid. Sophia's was salt and pepper gray. Una's, the auburn, of the pastel portrait done 3 years before her death that I'd seen on the wall at the Concord Free Public Library. In the portrait, Una's braid was coiled neatly around her head. Her hair shimmered safely two-dimensional behind glass. Here, the strands were a deep, rusty red and real. It took a few days, beyond the next morning's solemn procession in the cemetery, the touching remarks of more Hawthorne descendants at graveside, the speeches for the public under a tent on the grounds of the old manse where Una was born so long ago in early spring, a third spirit linked forever to our own, Nathaniel had written to Sophia. Is she not thine and mine, the symbol of the one true union in the world of our love in paradise? It took me a few days to realize what had puzzled and disturbed me as I peered into the coffin. What I'd seen wasn't supposed to be. I should have found one braid of gray and one of white. In a 1978 essay, the literary critic Elizabeth Hardwick, who was leery of biography, although she would go on to write one herself on Herman Melville, complained of the way historical figures are fixed by the glue of biography. Her subject was the living movie star Faye Dunaway. Hardwick argued that film actors succeed by establishing a trademark look that, once imprinted on the mind, refuses to change its meaning from one role to the next. It's the star cast in stone we go to see again and again. In Hardwick's view, the biographer's goal is the same, to sculpt a fixed persona that remains consistent and easily recognizable through the narrative. By the end of the book, the biographer has cast her pliant, real-life subject in stone, fixed her in amber or glue. Few biographers I know would agree. They might have closed the book on their subject, reluctantly or with relief, but the spirit lingers untethered and tempting in transcriptions of letters and journals we'd still like to quote, stored away in file folders we can't bear to toss, in inspirational messages tacked to bulletin boards that continue to fire us up, in photos hanging on our office walls that won't stop staring at us expectantly. The relationship endures, even if we go on to write about someone else. The late James Atlas, whose first biography of the poet Delmore Schwartz was published in 1977, before the internet age, chose Saul Bellow for his next book. That project carried him into the digital age when, Atlas once told me, his password on secure websites and at ATMs was always some variation on Delmore. He could not shake the attachment to his first subject. And the character we've come to know, almost like a family member, is hardly static. The curiosity that drove us to examine a life so rigorously we could fill hundreds of pages with its facts just won't quit. New information comes our way from knowledgeable readers, or we may even seek it out. A biographer of Margaret Fuller from the 1990s, the late Joan von Maren, couldn't stop puzzling over the mystery that had eluded Fuller's biographers, not to mention her grieving family members and friends, ever since the pioneering feminist died at age 40 in a shipwreck. Had Margaret Fuller actually married the young Italian nobleman who fathered her child? All three drowned in the wreck off Fire Island, and Fuller had never described a wedding or given a date in the letters she began to write home, confessing the secret love affair she'd carried on during the 2 years she lived in Rome, reporting on the Italian Revolution for Horace Greeling's New York Tribune. When she decided to bring her family back to America in 1850, she simply announced she was married and began to use a new name. But was she truly Margaret Fuller, Marchesa de Soli? Fuller's first biographers concocted their own story to protect her reputation from posthumous scandal, with a wedding date set just before little Nino Assoli's conception. Each successive biographer sifted the few shreds of evidence to offer a version that aligned with their view of Fuller. Yes, she'd married at last, finding womanly fulfillment. No, she hadn't, adhering to her stated belief that marriage is a corrupt social contract. Finally, while verifying Fuller's Roman addresses in an Italian archive devoted to real estate transactions, a few years after completing her own account, Joan von Maren mentioned her frustration with the mystery to a fellow researcher, Roberto Colzi, a retired banker with an interest in Roman architecture. Now his curiosity was piqued, leaving von Maren to her project of developing an itinerary for a tour group of Fuller scholars. Colzi scoured numerous church archives and eventually retrieved a record of Nino's baptism, which clearly stated his parents were coniugi, a married couple. I have to thank Richard Copley, whose publication Resources in American Literary Studies published this information. Questions remained. When did they marry? Might they have dissembled? But here at last was something to work with and proof of Fuller's intent to make the connection legal. Future biographers could start their own investigations there. But Una Hawthorne was calling to me. I'd ended my book with her birth, but I hadn't closed my mind to her presence in the sources I'd consulted while researching her parents' lives and reconstructing the love story that played a prominent role in my narrative, a romance that seemed surprisingly modern. The Hawthornes met after each had served a solitary apprenticeship of a decade or more in their profession. Nathaniel Hawthorne was among the first American writers of fiction to attempt to make a living by his pen. Lack of a steady income was the reason for his 3-year secret engagement to Sophia Peabody, the gifted painter who'd won his heart with a sketch of one of his characters. They didn't cohabit, as a pair of artists might today, but they considered themselves married from the date of their engagement and addressed each other in passionate love letters as husband and wife. When, at last, they planned a wedding in July 1842, Nathaniel joked that in performing the ceremony, the minister would have to thrust himself between them. The Hawthornes were older parents with a penchant for idealizing themselves and the Edenic surroundings into which their first child was born, a veritable fairyland on the banks of the Concord River, sheltered from the turmoil of life's ocean, in Nathaniel's description. Sophia had suffered a miscarriage during an otherwise blissful honeymoon year, and she recorded the loss in words etched with the diamond on her wedding ring into a window pane of the moss-grown country parsonage her husband dubbed the Old Manse, rented out to them by their near neighbor, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Man's accidents are God's purposes. Una's arrival during the second year of their marriage must have been by divine intent. Over the objections of friends who worried the choice was too imaginative, the couple adhered to a decision made before the child's birth to name her for the notably virtuous heroine of Edmund Spenser's epic poem, The Faerie Queen, the king's only daughter dear. Nathaniel agreed there was risk in selecting a name that has never before been warmed with human life. But in her first weeks, Una's living presence had given it a natural warmth, her father claimed. He expected that when she has worn it through her lifetime and perhaps transmitted it to descendants of her own, this beautiful name will have become naturalized on earth, whereby we shall have done a good deed in first bringing it out of the realm of fairy. Yet the months after Una's birth brought hardship. Sophia nursed her baby, and soon also another little girl born that year in Concord to Margaret Fuller's sister Ellen, whose breast milk failed. Nathaniel sold stories to magazines, but payment was minimal and erratic. By winter, the Hawthorns could no longer afford to rent the Old Manse. They made plans to move to Salem and a house they'd share with Nathaniel's widowed mother and two unmarried sisters. There would be more Hawthorne children, but only Una had been born during the calm summer of my heart and mind, as Nathaniel designated the Old Manse years in the introduction to his collection of stories published after the move in hopes of recouping his losses. Sophia left behind a second inscription on a window pane, marking the former rectory with an indelible image of Una's infant happiness. I read the delicate tracings myself on the day of the reinterment. Una Hawthorne stood on this windowsill, January 22nd, 1845, while the trees were all glass chandeliers, a goodly show, which she liked much, though only 10 months old. Another vision of Una had stayed with me from a book published in the 1950s by Columbia professor Vernon Loggins called The Hawthorns. Loggins traced the genealogy of the family through 7 generations, beginning with Nathaniel's colonial ancestors and ending with his daughters, Una and Rose, and their middle sibling, a brother, Julian. In the final chapters, Loggins described Una's death a little over 3 decades after her auspicious birth. By then, both Hawthorne parents were dead, and both Rose and Julian had married. Una herself was engaged to a young writer of short stories, Albert Webster. While visiting Julian's family at their home on the outskirts of London, Una received word that the tubercular Webster had succumbed to illness on a ship bound for Hawaii, where he'd hoped to regain his health in advance of their wedding. Her fiancé was dead. During the next several months, Una's auburn hair turned completely white, Loggins wrote, and the least physical exertion caused fatigue. Una left Julian's house for a rest stay at an Anglican convent near Windsor, where within days she suddenly grew very weak. A message was sent to Julian, but before he arrived, she was no more. The story had always seemed improbable to me. Then, by chance, I'd seen Una's hair, and it was not white. Someone was lying. I began searching for clues to what might have happened. How had the story of Una's extraordinary physical decline come into being? And since I now knew the tale to be false in at least one significant particular, how had Una Hawthorne died? The first was easy to answer. Julian, who'd been summoned to Una's sickbed, offered it up in his own biography of his illustrious parents, the 2-volume Nathaniel Hawthorne and his wife. Why not believe him? He'd lived with Una during her last months, and he'd seen her in death, or so he said. One of the Kluwer sisters of the community of St. John Baptist met him at the railroad station in Windsor. We drove to the convent, and there, in the little cell-like room on a narrow bed, she lay. In Julian's version, Una's dark auburn hair had become quite gray, and her vital functions and organs were, as the physician afterwards told me, those of an old woman. Loggins had merely improved on Julian's details, turning quite gray hair to the more dramatic, completely white. The dissembling began with Julian, the only one in a position to manufacture a story. Yet, as I turned to the records of the Hawthorne's family life, including 2 newly surfaced unpublished accounts of Una's last years, I had to wonder whether Julian was simply putting the finishing touches on a cover-up that had begun long before. It was the little girl Una I knew best. Indeed, millions of American high school graduates know her by proxy after reading The Scarlet Letter in English class. She may not have been the baby in Hester Prynne's arms as the novel's protagonist emerged from prison after serving her term for adultery in the book's opening scene. That baby blinked and turned away from the bright sunlight after spending her first 3 months in a dungeon. But Una was there in the elf child who danced through most of the following pages as Hester strove to keep the peace between the Reverend Arthur Dimsdale, her secret lover, who was Pearl's unacknowledged father, and the wizened alchemist Roger Chillingworth, Hester's long-lost husband, newly arrived in the Puritan village to take his vengeance. Nathaniel's older sister, Elizabeth, who lived upstairs in the Hawthorne Salem household as her brother wrote his first novel, the year Una turned 5, noticed the resemblance right away. Pearl was unlike any other child, unless it be Una, she wrote after the book was published. Nathaniel's journals record impressions of Una that he transferred to his book. Like Pearl, when Una played outdoors with neighborhood children, they gaze at her with a kind of wonder, recognizing that she is not altogether like themselves. Like Pearl, Una displayed an uncanny knowingness and a readiness to unsettle. There is something that almost frightens me about the child. I know not whether elfish or angelic, but at all events, supernatural. She steps so boldly into the midst of everything, shrinks from nothing, has such a comprehension of everything. Una was a spirit strangely mingled with good and evil, haunting the house where I dwell. Was Una entering his novel, or was Nathaniel seeing Una as the character he'd imagined into being, the love child who could not be kept from asking unwanted questions or speaking truths she intuited from the adults around her? Or was Una just a normally inquisitive and unpredictable little girl, whose father, unused to the ways of small children, is also a uniquely talented and ambitious writer, whose mother channeled her own aesthetic passion into the dream of becoming a great man's helpmeet, even as she'd honed her skills as a painter during her single years? Sophia Peabody harbored the private hope, set down in a poem in her diary titled "To the Unknown, Yet Known," that she would someday find an artistic genius as her soulmate and devote herself to his welfare. It must have seemed to Sophia that Nathaniel Hawthorne had stepped right out of her poem. Strikingly handsome, yet painfully shy, he'd published his first stories anonymously in periodicals. When a reviewer revealed his name in a favorable notice, Nathaniel was secretly pleased. He wrote in his journal, referring to the room in the family home in Salem where he'd sequestered himself to draft and redraft so many pages, "In this dismal and squalid chamber, fame was won." That was 5 years before his wedding and over a decade before The Scarlet Letter sold out its first printing in 10 days, making him truly famous and conferring on the Hawthorne children the dubious honor of becoming the offspring of an eminent man of letters, soon to be one of America's first celebrity authors. A century later, it would be a common story. Aspiring writer seeks acclaim to assuage childhood deprivation. Nathaniel hardly knew his sea captain father, who died abroad when the boy was 4. His mother withdrew in protracted mourning. only to offer his own children a perilous mix of pampering, heightened expectation, and neglect. But in the young America of the Hawthornes, Emersons, and Alcotts, child-rearing in a literary household was something new. During her early years, Una Hawthorne's parents moved the family 4 times in search of a suitable writing perch for her father, finally returning to Concord, home to Concord, and a rambling farmhouse Nathaniel called the Wayside when she was 8 years old. Nathaniel had written 2 more novels, increasing his fame, but only scarcely his wealth. The once bold Una had begun to alarm her parents with an unaccountable lethargy, or premature ennui, in Nathaniel's description, and she spoke of wishing to slip into God. His daughter suffered, the writer supposed, from mere idleness and the want of a purpose in life. Should she be allowed to attend school, which might provide a much happier childhood than we can secure to her by a home education? The decision for now, and ultimately for all of Una's school years, was no. Sophia, who had never attended school aside from those taught in her own home by her mother and older sister Elizabeth, would do the job herself. She was intent on crafting the best pictures I ever painted. The Hawthornes moved to England in 1853, the same year suffragist Paulina Wright Davis began to publish America's first women's rights journal, the Una, adopting Spencer's intrepid princess as avatar for her paper devoted to the elevation of women. Nathaniel would serve as the American consul in the bustling port at Liverpool, a lucrative political appointment he'd earned by writing a campaign biography for his Bowdoin College classmate, the newly elected President Franklin Pierce. Una was 9, and her father sometimes teasingly called her Onion, perhaps to win a smile from the daughter born of the one true union in the world, but also in recognition of the layers no one could penetrate, Una's rhinoceros armor against sentiment or tenderness. He decided that Una was, like himself, more readily awakened by fiction than realities. She loved to read. Through 4 years in England and another 2 spent in Italy after Nathaniel's term as consul ended, the children's lessons were supervised by Sophia and a succession of young governesses. One of these, the recent Antioch College graduate Ada Shepherd, whose letters and sketchbooks are held here in special collections, a gift from Ada's descendant Susan Abely. The Hawthornes' governess, Ada Shepherd, described a typical parlor scene with Nathaniel ensconced in an easy chair in a meditating mood, his eyes resting occasionally upon his lovely children as they pursued each some favorite pastime, Julian drawing shells for which he has the greatest passion, Una reading Sir Walter Scott's poems, and little Rose flitting about among her toys, while Mrs. H., the beautiful mother of this interesting group, reclined on the sofa with the London papers. There were frequent outings, particularly in Rome and Florence, to museums, parks, palaces, and cathedrals. Both Julian and Rose became adept at sketching. A family album includes Julian's portrait of a quite differently comported Una, eyes fixed in a spectral gaze, hair released from its confining braid and wildly askew. An image that may speak more truth about Una than Julian's published account of her demise. The undated sketch could have documented any of the several dark episodes of his older sister's young life. I should say that this image is in the exhibit case along with the letter that I just quoted and other sites. Except not the lock of Una's hair that I just learned was donated to the old mints at the time of the reinterment. I have to look for that. Anyway, at 15 in Rome, Una contracted malaria and lingered near death for days, a brush with tragedy that brought the Hawthornes' Italian idyll to a close. At 16, shortly after the family returned to America, Una suffered a mental collapse. There's little record of what happened aside from Nathaniel's letter to Franklin Pierce of October 1860, written from the Wayside, reporting that all the violent symptoms were allayed by the first application of electricity. and within 2 days she was in such a condition as to require no further restraint. An early form of electroshock therapy, medical electricity, had succeeded in calming Una's derangements, which the practitioner attributed to a liver complaint and a slight affection of the heart, probably produced or strengthened by the Roman fever. Yet malaria, termed Roman fever by the English-speaking tourists who suffered from it, is not known to cause residual bouts of insanity. Nathaniel might not have written so openly to his friend of Una's case if he hadn't believed in the diagnosis and the promise of his daughter's complete restoration. Her parents had been assured that if Una maintained a proper diet and exercised regularly, we need have no apprehension of future mental disturbance. Still, the episode was kept from all but an inner circle of friends and family. Rose was told simply that Una had been ill. Once again, Una was kept home from school. The best one in Concord was coeducational, and only Julian, now age 14, was allowed to attend. After her recovery, Una enrolled in a nearby girls' gymnastics academy to learn calisthenics. Down the road in Concord, the Emerson daughters, Edith and Ellen, 3 and 5 years older than Una, were being groomed for lives of service to their parents, the often invalided Lydian and the eminent sage Ralph Waldo, known to all as Waldo. I want to credit biographer Kate Culkin's writing on the Emerson sisters here. Edith Emerson resisted the plan, marrying at 24 into a wealthy China trade family, making a different sort of contribution to the family's well-being. Ellen, named for her father's first wife, Ellen Tucker Emerson, who died of tuberculosis after a year of marriage, remained single. Ellen attended school with her siblings in Concord as a child. At 14, she was sent to a boarding school in the Berkshires, only to be called back a year later when her father left on an extended lecture tour to stay at home and keep house for her mother. Another year at a girls' academy in Cambridge followed. Then, at 17, Ellen embarked on my career as superintendent of the house, which stretched through the 3 remaining decades of her parents' lives and beyond, as she helped edit her father's posthumous works. The Hawthornes household was not as social as the Emersons, nor did Una's reclusive father travel frequently. She was not pressed into service at an early age. Such a mission might have supplied the purpose in life that had eluded her since childhood, but in the end, there was no need. Nathaniel fell ill, probably from stomach cancer, and died at 60, the year Una turned 20. 7 years later, after the surviving family members had moved back to Europe in hopes of eking out a more comfortable living on Nathaniel's royalties, Sophia died of pneumonia in London at 63. Julian had married, Rose was engaged. Exhausted from tending her mother through her final illness and more alone than she'd ever been, Una fell apart. Her aunt, Elizabeth Peabody, intellectual impresario of the Transcendentalist movement and a contributor to the Una, crossed the Atlantic to see to her niece's care and reported on the relapse of violent symptoms by letter to a trusted family friend. A letter I was permitted to read and quote from by the collector and educator Kent Bicknell, who's here somewhere. Yeah. Elizabeth Peabody, too, might not have written in such detail if she hadn't shared her late brother-in-law's belief that Una's illness was an entirely physical disease and amenable to medical treatment. She named her niece's condition insanity, an old story with us, Una's family. After Sophia's death in March 1871, Una had been insane all summer by fits, during which, Elizabeth wrote, she always believes when in them that some man is in love with her, whom it is her duty to marry, or he will die of grief. And she has had this illusion at different times with respect to 8 different persons. Elizabeth reached London in the fall after a telegram alerted her that Una's stay at a water cure establishment had ended badly. There, the mania rose to its height, and she became dangerous to the life of the servant who had her in charge by her usual symptom of seizing her and squeezing her, from which seizure it took strong men to separate her. Una was sent directly to the insane hospital, where doctors ordered the family never to speak to Una of the delusions she experienced during her fits of derangement. The most important thing for her is that she should not mingle her insane impressions with the sane ones, or she would become incurable. Una was 27 years old. Elizabeth remained in London through the several months of Una's hospitalization while also helping to settle Sophia's estate, a task that had overwhelmed the Hawthorne children. Una emerged calm again and intent on taking up charitable work supported by a newly established order of Anglo-Catholic nuns, the Clewer Sisters. She'd joined the Church of England before her mother's death, favoring the congregation at St. Barnabas, near the family's home in South Kensington, the first church in England built by ritualists, members of a rising faction in the Anglican Church who advocated a return to long-abandoned Catholic practices, services conducted in Latin, pews open to all free of charge, the formation of celibate sisterhoods to serve the poor. Una might even become a Clewer sister herself. Traveling on to Rome for a stay with friends before returning to Boston, Elizabeth Peabody confided more, and her story found its way into the private diary of expatriate newspaper columnist Anne Hampton Brewster in a passage recently discovered by literary historian Etta Madden. Una's insanity had taken a religious turn. So far had her aberration gone that she imagined she was the bride of Christ. One morning she'd wandered off in a half-clad condition without shoes, only in stockings, searching for her Lord, for her dear spiritual bridegroom who would give her peace. A young woman took pity on the ill and fainting Una and brought her home to a house of prostitution, where at first Una lay in a torpid, senseless state, almost as if dead. Then, to the surprise of everyone, she opened her eyes and solemnly began a sort of sermon, which set all the young strumpets to weeping. After spending a night under the polluted roof, Una led the whole company of feminine reprobates to St. Barnabas for the morning service, where her friends saw her enter with her strange companions and afterward entreat the clergyman to remonstrate and pray with the girls. The friends took Una home. What a sad, sad story, Anne Brewster exclaimed in her diary, and how like the Una of Spenser's poem to have wandered in a desert of danger, to enter the house of sin and shame and emerge untouched, spotless, and unharmed. Brewster then took up the refrain that would echo through most later writing about Una. She could not be separated from her father's fictions. The whole episode, Brewster wrote, was like something out of Nathaniel Hawthorne's peculiar romances. And with a father so impractical, moody, filled with all manner of unhealthy imaginings, occupied in every mode of morbid analytical examination of human emotions, Brewster concluded, no wonder one of the children went mad. Perhaps it was because I'd peered into a coffin once myself that I began to entertain questions from a second minor character in my book, the young Ellen Tucker Emerson, Waldo's first wife, for whom he had named his first daughter, born of his second marriage. How pretty the fair-haired Ellen Tucker had been, although her cheeks were flushed red with illness rather than health, and how talented. Several of the poems she'd written at 18, the year she married, made their way into the transcendentalist literary journal, The Dial, alongside poetry by her husband and his friends, Thoreau and Fuller, a full decade after Ellen's death at age 19 in 1831. Waldo mourned Ellen so deeply, found her early death so hard to accept that over a year afterward, on one of his daily visits to her grave, he opened the tomb and looked inside her coffin. He wanted to see for himself what death had done, his biographer Robert Richardson writes. Waldo recorded nothing more than the act, nothing of what he saw, yet the experience marked him. 5 years later, in his first great prose work, Nature, he wrote, "Even the corpse hath its own beauty." Ellen wasn't buried in the Emerson family plot. There was no cemetery at Sleepy Hollow in the 1830s, only untamed countryside surrounding a wooded glen. Nor had the newlywed Emersons lived in Concord. I wanted to know where Waldo had visited Ellen, perhaps visit myself, and I found that I could not find out. Powerfully contagious to those living in close quarters, tuberculosis swept through the Tucker family as it did the Emersons. Waldo lost a brother and sister in childhood before meeting Ellen, and would lose another 2 brothers to the disease during the decade after her death. As a young man, Waldo himself suffered from tuberculosis, which for a painful 9 months affected his eyes before sparing him to live into his 80s. Ellen Tucker's father died at 49 when she was only 9. He was entombed on the grounds of the family home in Roxbury, then a suburb of Boston. Ellen's older sister, Mary, joined him several years later, as did Ellen herself, soon to be followed by another sister, Margaret, and their mother. When the estate was sold, the Tucker family's remains were moved first to a cemetery in Roxbury and finally to a family plot purchased by Ellen's sole surviving relation, Paulina Tucker Nash, at lavish Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. This third interment took place in 1878. By the end of the century, the family's Roxbury home was torn down and replaced with a commercial block, brick storefronts all in a row. There was no longer a tomb, not even a parcel of land to visit as Waldo had. Waldo Emerson was still living in 1878. He was 75. Did the man who had once visited his beloved's grave daily, imploring, "Dost thou not hear me, Ellen?" have a say in the place of her ultimate burial? What would Ellen have wanted? In middle age, Waldo purchased his own family plot in the new cemetery at Sleepy Hollow and moved the remains of his mother, dead in 1853 at 85, and firstborn child, Ralph Waldo Jr., who died at 5 of scarlet fever, to the commanding hillside that would become known as Author's Ridge. Waldo had his mother's remains transferred undisturbed, but again he looked into a coffin, little Waldo's, and again left no comment. Nor is there any sign in his surviving letters and journals of 1878 that Waldo had been consulted on Ellen's interment at Mount Auburn. He'd stayed in touch with Paulina, sending her copies of each of his books published since the 1850s. In 1875, he sent Parnassus, a 500-page anthology of favorite poetry, meant to be read aloud by families at fireside. But for the selection of his own poems that appeared a year later, Parnassus was his last published work. Along with well-known verses by Chaucer, Milton, and Wordsworth, Parnassus included dozens written by Waldo's American contemporaries, most of them friends, Thoreau, Ellery Channing, Ellen Sturgis Hooper. There were none by Ellen Emerson, but Waldo printed his tubercular brother Edward's The Last Farewell, the 26-year-old's parting thoughts as he sailed out of Boston Harbor to Puerto Rico on what he rightly suspected would be a failed voyage to recover his health. In each stanza, Edward bids a fond farewell to church spire, hometown, mother, brothers, and concludes with the plaintive refrain, "Far away, far away." Waldo said his last goodbye to Edward the same year Ellen died. No, it would not have been right so many decades later to separate Ellen from her family, if that were even possible. The Concord sage, who had twice seen the work of death and whose own death beckoned 5 years in the future, knew that much. Unable to visit Ellen in Roxbury, I located her ultimate resting place in a secluded dell at Mount Auburn Cemetery, where I brushed aside the ivy that clung to the worn flat ledger stone, listing the names of father, mother, sisters, and read the bold inscription, "Ellen Tucker, wife of Ralph Waldo Emerson." I could not conjure her presence in this rolling green landscape on the outskirts of a city where she had never lived, but I felt the separation of space and time neither Waldo nor Ellen had wanted to endure. There is one birth and one baptism and one first love, and the affections cannot keep their youth any more than men, Waldo had written in his journal 5 days after Ellen's death, urging himself on to a new life without her. I envisioned far away in Concord on Author's Ridge, Waldo's own monument, an immense block of iridescent rose quartz, rising uncarved and craggy, emblem of the many years he survived Ellen, and then his neighbors, Thoreau and Hawthorne, amassing a body of work that still lives. Could he have done all that with Ellen? Or had her death somehow enabled his ascent, as if they'd once balanced on a seesaw of fate? I'd visited Sophia and Una's original graves at London's Kensal Green Cemetery in 1989 on a research fellowship. It was only my second trip to Europe, and I'd never seen a hawthorn in bloom before, let alone the lush pink and white hedgerows that marked walking paths and the borders of farmlands out my window as I rode the train from Liverpool to London in late May. Kensal Green was a vast expanse of headstones and monuments, but I looked for the hawthorn tree I knew Una had planted beside Sophia's grave in 1871, and there it was, a great cascading waterfall of pink blossoms, sheltering both hawthorn women now, and offering me welcome shade on a hot afternoon. I was far from home, and so were they. But that seemed fitting. It had been their choice to leave America and settle in London, and that's where I found them. Studying the short span of years recorded on Una's stone, I had wondered then whether Una's death, explained so melodramatically by her brother and thereafter attributed to a broken heart by family and friends, had been a suicide. When I heard about the planned reinterment at Sleepy Hollow, the reunion, I was troubled by the erasure of the history I'd traced. But nearly 2 decades had passed since my pilgrimage, and Sister Mary Joseph told me the hawthorn tree had died and fallen across the headstones, breaking Sophia's in 2. The cost to repair and refurbish the site would be significant for the Rosary Hill home, which had long paid for maintenance. The decision was made to repatriate the remains of the founder's father and sister instead. As with the several interments of Ellen Emerson, this was history too. And by sheer coincidence, the transfer revived my early question, giving me cause to pursue it. To this day, surviving family members often choose to cover up a suicide, to print the standard euphemism, died unexpectedly, in obituaries. But in the mid-19th century England, there were powerful legal incentives to suppress a suicide. Self-murder was a crime against the crown, still classified as homicide at the time of Una's death. A person who attempted suicide but failed could receive a lengthy prison term, finally reduced to 2 years in 1879. Just 5 years before Una's death in 1877, a corollary law requiring that a suicide's property be turned over to the Crown was rescinded. For centuries, British law mandated the burial of a suicide at a public crossroads with a stake through the heart to be trampled upon and forgotten. That changed with an 1823 statute, which nevertheless denied a suicide Christian burial rites and required interment after dark, a law still in effect when Una died. A hastily convened court proceeding could remove these penalties by judging the deceased insane, yet, as historian Barbara Gates writes in Victorian Suicide, while the English openly mourned death and sensationalized murder, they seem to have deeply feared suicide and to have concealed it whenever possible. Charlotte Sturkey, proprietress of St. Andrew's Cottage, the home of rest for ladies where Una died, who signed the death certificate as witness, would have had reason to cooperate in concealing a self-murder that took place on church grounds. In the years after Una's death, St. Andrew's Cottage required its residents to provide a doctor's attestation of sound mental health. Una's death certificate lists pyrosis, digestive complaints, and exhaustion as causes of death. The brief obituary of Miss Una Hawthorne, a daughter of the American novelist, that appeared in the South London Chronicle 5 days later must have relied on Julian's testimony. After her fiancé died, she had slowly lost strength and gradually faded out of life without any specific disease. Julian had known his sister's death would attract press attention, like that of 18-year-old Malcolm Melville, son of their father's friend Herman Melville, whose suicide by handgun 10 years before was reported in newspapers around the globe. The Chronicle added a detail I had not read anywhere else. September was the month in which Una was to have married. Una could have traveled to Clure with a lethal dose of laudanum tucked into her traveling bag, or a packet of arsenic powder, which her mother had taken in homeopathic dilutions as a cure for her frequent headaches. An elixir of arsenic had killed the teenage poet Thomas Chatterton, whose death by suicide was immortalized in a painting of the 1850s by pre-Raphaelite Henry Wallace, picturing a handsome youth stretched full length on a narrow bed, his pallid face contrasting sharply with copper red hair. Papers strewn about, and vial of poison rolling away from a limp hand grazing the bare wooden floor. Laudanum, morphine powder dissolved in alcohol, was the choice of 32-year-old Lizzie Siddall, muse to the inner circle of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and a talented painter herself whose afterlife secured her fame. Here, I want to thank Laura Rockefeller, not only for research assistance in British archives, but also for bringing Siddall's case to my attention. It was Lizzie Siddall whose brilliant red locks and pale complexion established the pre-Raphaelites' signature motif, after one of their members spotted her at work in a milliner's shop and invited her to pose. Of the many portraits that followed by Walter Deverell, who discovered Siddall, William Holman Hunt, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the best known is John Everett Millet's Drowning Ophelia, for which Siddall posed long hours in a sopping wet gown, immersed in a bath of water that quickly turned cold. The resulting pneumonia led to her dependence on laudanum. Rossetti painted Siddall most often and made thousands of sketches. The two were lovers. Eventually, they married. It was Rossetti who found her dead, laudanum bottle drained, suicide note at her side. A note that had to be burned to secure the judgment of insanity required for a Christian burial. The grieving Rossetti placed a manuscript of his poems in her coffin only to wish them back 7 years later. That's when friends entered the cemetery after dark to dig up the coffin and retrieve the poems. Afterward, they told Rossetti his wife's pale face was beautiful as ever, and her hair had grown to fill the coffin, glowing red in the light of the bonfire they'd set to illuminate the excavation. Lies meant to console that took hold in the popular imagination, turning Lizzie Siddall into a cult figure, the subject of novels, movies, comic books, and TV dramas into the 21st century. I returned to Concord to look more closely at Una's portrait, hanging in a stairwell, as it was, but now here. Hanging in a stairwell I'd used many times to reach the library's basement archive for research. I'd remembered the red hair, but not the ghostly pallor or the vacant look in the sitter's eyes. I thought of the description of Una at age 20 by the writer-editor Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a family friend who visited the wayside after Nathaniel's death. Her magnificent hair blazed and glittered upon me in the doorway most unexpectedly. In Higginson's recollection, Una was tall, beyond the average height of women, absolutely erect. It was this nobleness of carriage which first arrested attention, and her superb Titianesque coloring which afterwards held it. The abundant hair of reddish auburn and the large gray eyes. Walter Deverell had described Lizzie Siddall to his friends in remarkably similar terms. She's like a queen, magnificently tall, with a lovely figure, gray eyes, and her hair is like dazzling copper. Not surprisingly, the two artists to whom Una's portrait is credited, Henriette Corcoran and William Gorman Wills, were exponents of the pre-Raphaelite school. Corcoran had visited Rossetti in his studio and admired his portraits of Lizzie Siddall. Wills was better known as a playwright, but he too painted an ashen, red-haired Ophelia. Corcoran's parents maintained a literary salon in South Kensington where Wills often stayed while writing his plays. I knew from Elizabeth Peabody's letter that while she was alive, Sophia Hawthorne discouraged Una from forming a friendship with their neighbors, the Bohemian Corcorans. But Una was drawn to their circle in the months after her mother's death while recovering from her breakdown. I longed to put on canvas a record of her strange, weird personality, the faraway look in her magnificent eyes, the glorious amber hair, and the throat and neck like white Carrara marble, Henriette Corcoran recalled in a late memoir she titled Celebrities and I. Una was a living modern Ophelia. She was also, Corcoran couldn't help adding, the living embodiment of her illustrious father's heroines. Her short history, so pathetic and tragic, would have suited his romantic, weird genius. Both Higginson and Corcoran wrote about Una because she was her father's daughter. Higginson had traveled to Concord with the aim of examining Nathaniel's manuscripts, and Una obliged, showing him her father's notebooks and leading him on a walk to the old manse where she'd been born. Higginson paused to read the inscription in the window her mother had made on Una's behalf. I looked at her and thought it might be another tale for the Wonder Book, Higginson wrote afterward, referring to Nathaniel's popular stories for children. Even Una traded on her father's name. She did not join the Kluwer sisters, as some had expected, nor did she take up the reform of erring women, as gossip had it back in Concord. But she helped to establish a home for orphans in London, and she solicited financial assistance for the asylum by publishing notices in the Times. Will not some of those who have read my father's works come to our aid? Her plea in verse, Hawthorne at Christmas, appeared in Punch in December 1872. All ye who've sat tranced in reading Hawthorne's House of the Seven Gables, for a Hawthorne house I'm pleading, peopled with fair facts, not fables. The poem continues for several stanzas and concludes with the assurance that the funds Una sought, 300 British pounds to keep our little refuge from closing, will make Hawthorne's daughter glad. What could make Hawthorne's daughter glad? Had Una ever been glad? It was impossible she would ever be happy, a friend who knew her well wrote after Una's death. But was this a grieving friend's retrospective judgment, a way to diminish the tragedy? I tried to distinguish fact from fable in the several posthumous accounts of Una's last years I could find, all of them attempts to explain what might in the end have been inexplicable. She had been engaged once before and broken it off, or was jilted. She had been in love with Rosa's husband before her little sister married him, or was not. She had known Webster was too sick to live, or she did not. There seemed no end to the back and forth, and some of these rumors, I learned, had made it into newspapers, no doubt exacerbating whatever distress she may actually have felt. Was it possible, I began to wonder, that everyone spinning these tales knew and were signaling to each other in some code, impossible for me to decipher, that Una's death was a suicide? Perhaps Julian had not lied. He'd told the truth in a lost language. Una had taken Higginson to Sleepy Hollow on his visit to Concord, plucked a bouquet from the periwinkles growing around her father's headstone, and handed it to him. I decided to follow them there. I drove the short distance from the library, past the village green, and through the cemetery gates to park at the base of Author's Ridge, then climbed the narrow path to the Hawthorne plot on what Higginson had called a lovely wooded knoll. The oaks and evergreens were taller now and kept the spot in perpetual shade. Nothing but moss was growing on hard earth, compacted by the footsteps of literary pilgrims who deposited flowers, pencils, and coins at the base of Nathaniel's headstone, despite the low iron chain meant to keep tourists out. Sophia and Una's stones, grand Gothic arches of white marble transported from Kensal Green, had been cut down to fit the smaller scale of a New England town cemetery. Still, they dwarfed Nathaniel's simple marker, bearing only his last name. Una's date of death had vanished, lost when her stone was resized. In the absence of that finality, it was tempting, if I'd wanted to follow other writers' leads, to imagine that Una's ambiguous fate had been foreordained by her father long ago, when he cast her as Hester Prynne's daughter in his first novel. But where was little Pearl, he asked at the end of the Scarlet Letter. She'd inherited Roger Chillingworth's fortune and sailed away to some unknown region. Beyond that, all was conjecture. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote, "If still alive, she must now have been in the flush and bloom of early womanhood. None knew, nor ever learned with the fullness of perfect certainty, whether the elf child had gone thus untimely to a maiden grave, or whether her wild, rich nature had been softened and subdued and made capable of a woman's gentle happiness. Perhaps Una herself had not been able to break free of her father's vision for her. But I would not assist in turning Una Hawthorne into a fiction. That was the lesson I'd learned from looking inside a coffin. There are a few things we can know for sure: a patch of cloth, a fragment of bone, a red braid. And then there are the questions we can't answer." Thank you. So that was kind of long, but I think we can have a few questions, maybe just a few questions if you have any questions. And there are probably people here who know more than I do about this. Yeah, Kristen.
Has anybody ever looked at Una from an Anglo-Catholic?
That's what I was trying to do. I did a lot of, the question is, has anybody looked at Una from an Anglo-Catholic point of view? A physical missionary, yes. So there's a lot of great material about the founding of the Kluwer sisters, and I did a lot of research on that. But no, that would be there could be more done on that. You have a good point. So, did you have a question?
I've always been curious about the name.
Oh, Una.
Una, where did that, is that symbolic or what?
So it comes from the Fairy Queen, Spenser's epic verse poem. There are many, are they called cantos? I'm trying to think. Yes, thank you. And Una is the daughter, sorry, I was more familiar with the story when I was writing this originally, but Una, well, there are many. Also, Una kind of unites the king and the queen who have become estranged. Is that right? I don't know. Maybe someone can someone give a very brief explanation of Una's role in the Fairy Queen? No, we're all Americanists here. Read the Fairy Queen. She was a spotless maiden and somehow rescued things by the end of Canto 3, and then there are other cantos with other heroines, and actually, Laura probably knows the Fairy Queen well. Okay. Anyway, look at it. You can read about the Fairy Queen, and that's where it comes from. And it was really a name you can tell from the fact that this first women's journal, the Una, took that name too. It symbolized something not just pure and virginal, but also very powerful, which was a sort of motif of the 19th century sense of chastity and virginity, which we hear from Margaret Fuller as well. So, anyway. Thanks. I think maybe we should go have the reception and stand under Emerson's sculpture. And I think a lot of friends here would like to chat with each other. And thank you again, Rita, for coming.